Good morning, homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. Today I'm doing kind of a massive pressure canning day, and so I thought I'd bring you along and just show you what I'm making. I'm not going to do a step-by-step detail here, but I thought it would be fun for you to just see what's going on. We are at the end of the gardening season. It is now October. Which is crazy. September just went by 1,000 miles an hour. And so I'm kind of using up what I have that needs to be processed, I can take advantage of in this moment. And then we also just got back from a week of vacation where we were what's called boondocking. And boondocking is when you camp without any services. So no electric hookup, no toilet, no running water. We have a little scamp camper that we just love. We've done a ton of camping over the years. We've been married for 25 years and did a lot of camping even before that. But you do reach an age, I'm 56, where you just don't have what it takes to sleep on the ground anymore unless you absolutely have to. It's like it doesn't matter how thick the sleeping pad is, it's just not enough. And so mostly what I wanted was bed on wheels. That was my primary criteria for the camper that we bought. The rest of it was all just gravy. And so we bought this little scamp. It's really lightweight. You can tow it with almost anything. And it has a great bed that we can just leave set up. But we did that for a week in the National Forest where we just brought jugs of water and camped. I'll put a link to, I've got a nice video of some of the adventures we had. Sorry, long story longer. The main point of that is it was really nice to have ready-made meals on those camping trips, and so I've been a little bit more inspired to do some more of that. And so today I am going to can Sloppy Joes, and then I'm also going to can it's called Senate bean soup. So basically a bean soup with ham stock and a little bit of ham in it. And I did some research. You can't pressure can just cured meat, so you can't like have a pressure can jar of just ham. That is not acceptable. The testing on it is that when you cure some meat, it changes the density, and that it's not, they don't know the times, and so it's one of those things that hasn't been well tested, and they just tell you not to do it. However, you can use ham as a flavoring in something. You just can't do an entire jar of ham. And so after a bunch of research to figure that out, I decided I was going to make some ham bean soup. I love ham bean soup. It was a staple of my childhood. Both of my parents, it was one of the few things they could actually agree on. They both loved it, and I grew up on it. And there's just nothing as comforting in the fall as a lovely ham bean soup. The Senate ham bean soup is because I don't know if it's still served, but for years it was served in the Senate cafeteria in the fall. And so this is a recipe that's based on that. When you're pressure canning soup, there's essentially an as you like it type of recipe in the National Center for Home Food Preservation books or website where there's certain things you can't include, but you can include a lot of things, and then as long as 50% of the jar is liquid, it is safe to can. And so you just put in there kind of what you want. You can't put in pasta, but you can put in beans and potatoes, which is what this recipe is going to have. And so I'm kind of on the fly, because it's an as you like it type of recipe. I'm adapting it based on my original recipe for Senate bean soup, which is from America's Test Kitchen, and one that I've used for years that I clipped out of a newspaper years and years and years ago. Normally, if you're pressure canning beans, if you're just doing beans, 5 pounds of beans will give you 7 quarts of pressure canned beans. And so what I did is I cut that in half because I want 7 quarts of soup, but it can't all be beans. It can only be 50% beans. So I used 2.5 pounds of beans, and then the rest of it will be stock and vegetables. I'll bring you around here. You can see how gelatinized that is. So very concentrated, lots of good bone broth in there from those hocks. And then the dogs got the leftover bones last night. They were very excited about that. So that's our stock. We cut up 5 cups of onions from my ongoing scratch and dent onions. I'm almost through them. I try to use the scratch and dent onions first, so that, because the other ones will store better. And then this is, the recipe calls for, the original recipe calls for 1 pound of beans, 2 celery stalks, 1 large onion, which is about 2 cups, 8 ounces of russet potato, peeled and diced. And I was thinking it had carrots in it. It does not have carrots in it, so excuse the brief carrot appearance at the beginning of this video. No carrots. And so what I'm doing, because I have 5 pounds of beans, 2.5 pounds of beans, I'm just doubling everything by 2.5. So instead of 2 stalks of celery, I'm using 5. Instead of 2 cups of onions, I'm using 5. Instead of 8 ounces of potato, I'm using 20. You can see this here. This is gopher. We have an ongoing issue with gophers in our garden. I trap them, and I'm pretty good about getting rid of most of them in the early spring. And then as the season goes on, I kind of run out of energy for it. It's hot, and the last thing I want to be doing is digging holes and putting gopher traps out there. And so I kind of lose the war come summer, and inevitably when I dig my potatoes, I find that I've got some that have been damaged by gophers. And usually they only eat part of it, and then the rest of the potato kind of scars over. It doesn't actually rot, and so I just go ahead and cut that part off and use it. It's disappointing, but it is what it is. And then the other thing that happened was we have 3 colleges in town, and one of them comes out and does tours, often in the fall, with students for different classes. And so I had an environmental studies class come out on Friday, and they helped me dig these potatoes. And these are lovely young students, most of them freshmen and sophomores. Most of them have never grown a potato in their life. And even though I demonstrate how far back to come, inevitably they don't follow my directions that closely, and we end up with potatoes that have that are cut in half by a shovel. And so I'm also rescuing scratch and dent potatoes that were, actually I think that one's gopher, scratch and dent potatoes that were cut in half by a shovel as well. I have 2 varieties here. One of these is a russet, and I'll put the names up on the screen. They don't occur to me right at the moment. And then the other one is a white potato. The recipe calls for all russets, but because I had a bunch of these white potatoes that had accidentally been damaged or that had gopher, I'm going to use both in this. The idea with the russet, I have 2 different recipes for Senate bean soup. One of them calls for mashed potatoes, and so really that potato is in there to dissolve and thicken and make the soup really creamy. And so I'm not using a waxy potato like a red potato, although I don't mind if this has little bits of potato in it. And in fact, it's probably better for canning if it does, just because I don't think the soup recipe it'll change the density if they are completely pulverized and turned into mashed potatoes. So I'm going to leave them in chunks and can them that way, and it will be fine. There's one that was a shovel that just got whacked. They went like 3/4 of the way through it and then realized what they'd done and stopped. So yeah, shovel accident on the potato there. And I need to go back through and redig as well. The other thing is that because they've never done it before, they don't have a sense of where the potatoes are, and the vines had already died back, so it was somewhat hard to find the plants. And I know there's probably half again as much as they dug out there that I just need to go dig again and rescue. But they saved me a whole bunch of time because half of them are out of the ground, so. This has been a really nice variety of white potato. I've really liked it. I think it's caribou. I can't remember if the russet or the white one is caribou. Actually, I think the white one is Kennebec and the russet is caribou. But they've both done really well for me. They do a nice sized potato. I'm not a great potato grower. I'm gonna try to figure out how to do the Ruth Stout method next year, which is when you just put them on the ground and then mulch heavily on top of them with straw or hay. My experience with doing things with straw and hay in our area is that it often has a lot of weed seeds in it, and that ends up being a nightmare. I once mulched potatoes with some leftover hay, or maybe it was straw, I can't remember, but I had a nightmare of grasses coming up in that, and then trying to get in there and weed in amongst the potatoes. It was a disaster. So it's part of why I've never done that method. And if I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna figure out how to do it in a way where I know that what I'm putting on top of it is not gonna end up being a weedy mess, because yeah, that was a nightmare. And so I end up digging a hole 8 to 12 inches down, putting the potato in there, covering the potato up, letting it start to grow, and then if I'm diligent, I come back and sort of mound the soil around it. A lot of times I don't remember or have time to do that in midsummer, and so inevitably that also leads to having quite a few potatoes that have got some green on them because they were too close to the surface. I often just save those and plant them the following year, so that becomes my seed potatoes for the next year, the green ones. You can scrape a lot of green off of potatoes and make them edible, but it's not ideal. All right, so you get the idea here. I'll turn you back on when I'm starting to put things together. All right, I have my giant stock pot going. And I'm going to start sauteing some of our veg here. The original recipe just calls for a tablespoon of oil. I'm going to put quite a bit more in there, about 2.5 tablespoons, again, keeping with the 2.5 times. And we're going to saute our onion and our celery. And we're just sweating this. We're not trying to get any color on it, so pretty low heat. 2.5 teaspoons of salt. And those ham hocks that I made this stock from, they do not have any salt in them. At least I don't think they do. I'll taste them, but this recipe is definitely going to need some salt. All right, we're going to get that going. That's gonna probably take more than 8 or 10 minutes. And then I need 5 cloves of garlic. And so I'm gonna do that while we're starting to get the rest of this going here. I love this particular variety of garlic. It's an heirloom variety from the area that I don't know the actual name of, although I do know the grouping that it's in, and I'll put that up on the screen. But you can see, even though this isn't a huge head, each individual clove is a very nice size. And so even when they don't get big, you still have a lot to work with. The individual cloves do not get tiny when it's a stunted or small. And so I call it Grandma Miller's because That's the house that it came out of. The woman who lived there for a very long time was named Miller, and then some new people bought it. And they had this garlic patch that hadn't been dug in years, and so they had tons and tons of garlic that was all pretty small, and they asked me if I wanted some, and I was like, absolutely. And so I grew it out the first year just thinking it was going to be really stunted because it had been not dug for so long. So I wasn't expecting the cloves to be very big the first year. When I dug it, I just thought I'd grow it out for a year and then replant it and then grow it out a second time. And I didn't even plant it that far apart that first year because I was thinking it wasn't going to get that big and I didn't want to waste the space. And they ended up like what you just saw there. So even though the heads weren't particularly large, the individual cloves were awesome. And so, yeah, it's now one of my favorite garlics. It's a hard neck, but it seems to have pretty good storage ability. I've kept it at room temperature just in a paper bag with the top rolled over, probably into February or March of the following year. So pretty good, considering it gets harvested in July. Got that little schmutz out there. And this called for 5 cloves, but some of these are small, so I'm going to call that good. And I've got my pressure canner going. It's just very slowly warming up because this is gonna have to cook for at least a half an hour, so there's no point in heating this super fast. Every pressure cooker is different. Follow the directions for the one that you got. Mine takes 3 quarts of water, which is a little high, I think, for some of them. I've seen some call for less. 3 quarts of water, and then I throw a couple tablespoons of white vinegar in there. It just keeps minerals from forming on the outside of the jars. And then you just slowly get it going. And then when it's at a full boil, we want to put the jars in there, vent it for 10 minutes, then start bringing the pressure up. And that's pretty much the same on every pressure cooker I've ever seen. So we'll just keep this moving. We'll crush this garlic. We'll start adding things to the pot. All right, it's been 10 minutes or so. Did get a tiny bit of browning on this. Not a big deal. That's what you get for putting it on low and running out to get parsley. This is always my biggest problem with cooking is I lack the patience to just stand and stir a pot. Okay, so that's onions and celery. Now we add in garlic. And this just cooks long enough to get a little smell out of it. Give that 30 seconds to a minute. I did throw a little bit of water into this just because it was too hot and I didn't want it to burn. So it's gonna take a minute. So this is our ham from the hocks the other day. I'm gonna put that in. These are our potatoes, and I just put them in water to keep them from browning while we were waiting. Put those in there. These are our beans, and these beans, it's a combination of pinto, myopa, I think is what it's called, and then a mix. Actually, there's some Whipple Creek in there, and then the rest of them were a mix of beans that I bought specifically as a random mix, and so it's just fun. There's just a ton of different colors in there. Traditionally, this would be made with navy bean, but I think part of the fun here is that we're gonna do a whole bunch of different kinds. And those were beans I grew last year. I grow dried beans every year. The water I'm putting in this is filtered
We have a reverse osmosis system underneath the sink. Our well water is very hard. It is totally potable, but it's full of minerals. And for things like beans, it can sometimes make things a little bit tough. And so I'm just gonna make sure I use filtered water in this. And the broth, this ham stock was also made with filtered water. In goes that. I'm sure we're gonna need more liquid. A couple of bay leaves. Yeah, so I grew these beans. I grow dried beans every year, and I shell them. Sorry about that noise. I pick them, throw them in the greenhouse to dry. Sometimes I pick the whole plant and throw them in the greenhouse to dry. And then sit in the winter and like binge watch YouTube and shell them. And I will usually keep them dried for about a year. And then if I haven't used them in that time, I will pressure can them. So I don't like to keep dried beans past about a year. They tend to get much harder to cook as they get older, and I always have new beans coming in, and so that's kind of I keep dried beans for a year, and then anything not used in that year gets pressure canned because the new stuff is coming in. So this is gonna be a fun mix here. So I'm making 7 quarts of soup, and so I'm gonna need at least half of that in liquid, and so that's gonna be 3.5 quarts. Which is almost a gallon. 4 quarts is a gallon. So 3.5 quarts of that is gonna be liquid. So I know I'm gonna have to add quite a bit more liquid into this mix. Our pot is just starting to come to a boil. I had about 7 cups of ham stock. And so you saw me top that off to 8, which is 2 quarts. And then I added another 1.5 quart of just boiling water to this, filtered boiling water. So 3.5 quarts of liquid. And we're just gonna see where we end up. This needs to cook. You par cook your beans when you're pressure canning them. There is this trend on YouTube right now where homesteaders are dry canning beans. They're putting dried beans into a jar, usually about maybe 1/3 of the total contents of the jar, filling the rest up with water and pressure canning it for the standard amount of time that you would do beans. That is not a tested recipe. It's not a tested method. I'm seeing it everywhere. It's making me a little bit crazy. I'm not the canning police. I am totally fine with people kind of riffing on stuff within safety guidelines, but they're not changing the time. And it takes a while for dried beans to absorb liquid and to start to actually cook. And so to keep the exact same time on your pressure canning that you would if the beans had been soaked and then par cooked is ludicrous. And somebody's gonna get hurt because they're not gonna be cooked enough and you're gonna end up with botulism. So, side note, don't do that. So what I did, I soaked these beans overnight. Actually, probably more than that, probably 24 hours. Overnight would have been fine. And then I am now going to par cook them for a half an hour so that they are going to absorb as much liquid as they're going to absorb, and then we will pressure can them. I'm also doing it with the other soup ingredients. You see I threw in the stems from the parsley. I'm going to throw some parsley in here in the end, but I thought the stems would actually add a little bit to the stock, and I'll just fish them out along with the bay leaves. Yeah, so we're going to set a timer for a half an hour and let that get happy. I tasted the meat from this, and it does appear to have been salted and cured, so I'm not adding any more salt than the initial salt that I added when I was sauteing the vegetables. The stock seems about in the right place in terms of saltiness, and I can always add more salt when I open it later. So no more salt went into this than what you saw, and yeah, we'll come back in a half an hour and start getting this potted up. Our beans have cooked for a half an hour. We're ready to pot this up. They do not have to be fully cooked. That half an hour cook time is to make sure that they are fully expanded. because they are gonna fully cook. They're gonna be in this pressure canner for 90 minutes is the time I think. I gotta look that up, but I think it's 90. And that is plenty time to cook a bean all the way through, even if it's really old. So that 30-minute cook time before you put them in the containers is to make sure that they are fully cooked and that they are fully hydrated, and that nothing is going to continue to expand within the jar, because that continued expansion could cause the jar to break. And so that's really the purpose. Normally you would, if you were making this recipe just for home and you weren't canning it, you would cook the beans in the pork stock, and then you would add your other ingredients. It's a different number or different order of steps. But because this is all just going to get pressure canned, I just threw everything in together and cooked the beans long enough to make sure they were fully hydrated. I had my mason jars in this hot liquid. I brought this to a boil earlier this morning and then turned it off because I wasn't ready for it yet. But in order to make sure that these were warm so that I don't accidentally crack a jar by putting hot liquid into a cold or room temperature jar, I went ahead and threw those in the pot just so that they would be preheated. All right, I'm gonna fish out my parsley sprigs, which are likely gonna be right on the top here. I'm also gonna stir this around and see if I can locate, there's one bay leaf. In the original recipe that I'm following from America's Test Kitchen did not call for bay, but some of the other recipes that I've researched over time, I've been making this recipe for 20 years, do call for bay. And so I thought it would be a nice addition. It just adds a little je ne sais quoi where you don't really taste that it has it in there, but it just tastes better. I feel like there's one more bay leaf. I think I put 3 in here. Oh, there's another parsley stem. There's always that elusive bay leaf. My husband and I have a standing joke that if I put a whole spice in anything and don't fish it out, it will end up in his dish. And I can have 2 gallons of liquid and put 2 cups in a bowl for him, and he'll get all of them. It's just, I don't know what it is, but it's something that happens all the time, and we laugh about it. Okay. I am pretty confident I'm going to need to add more liquid to this. And so I'm just going to dish this, ladle this into jars. The one other ingredient in this Cook's Illustrated recipe is apple cider vinegar, just to brighten everything up. I actually think that's a great idea. And so I am going to add, the original recipe called for a tablespoon, and again, 2.5 times, so 2.5 tablespoons. Tablespoon is 3 teaspoons, so 1/2 tablespoon is 1.5 teaspoons. So a little bit of additional acid in there just to brighten everything up. It's not gonna make any difference in terms of the preservation because these are pressure canned, but I feel like it's a good addition to the stock. All right, let's see. And I'm gonna do something weird that I never do. I'm gonna start with the far jar instead of the close jar. I always start with the jar closest and then end up dragging drops across everything. So I'm gonna, since that's gonna happen regardless, I'm gonna work my way in instead of working my way out. So about halfway. Is what we're looking for here. Half full of solids. And then we'll work on broth. I'm also trying to make sure I get a good mix from the bottom to the top in case like the meat is all sinking to the bottom of the bowl or the onions are all floating or something like that. So I'm going to try to mix this pretty well, which is also why I'm going to go back and forth, I think, rather than trying to do. I can put a little bit more in that one. And anything left over, if I'm not able to can all of these solids, which I probably won't be able to. I knew when I was adding all that other stuff that I was going to go over 7 quarts. We'll just have bean soup for dinner at some point. I need to spread these out so I can see them. All right, so I think that's about half full on these. It's easy to keep second guessing yourself. Now I'm going to focus on just getting broth, which is going to be a lot trickier. And this I'm definitely going to spread out because I know I'm going to not have enough and I'm going to have to add extra water to all of these. So I want to make sure that everybody gets a good dose of this beautiful ham hock broth. And I'm getting a few beans in there, but I'm not going to sweat it. The other thing I could do with this would be just a second canning batch, but I really don't want to do this. I don't need 10 of these. We don't eat bean soup that often. All right, that's about all I'm going to get out of that. I heated that water up earlier, so hopefully it's not going to take that long. I think I'm just going to make an executive decision here and put a tablespoon or so in each jar. A little bit of green, a little bit of flavor. Bean soup is not complicated. It's really, the flavor is all about that pork more than anything else. Throw some of this in our leftovers there. And what I'll do is dump this into a smaller pot and cook it the rest of the way, and we'll have it later this week for dinner. I'm gonna wipe rims while I'm waiting for that water to come to a boil. I had that boiling earlier, so it shouldn't take very long. This is also another, I use reused jars and I buy used jars. This is another opportunity to make sure I don't have any chips in my rims. That's at a good full rolling boil. I'm going to assume headspace on this is 1 inch. I will double check. So this is a nifty little measuring tool. We can come up to, I don't normally do this, but all of these jars are slightly different. I've got a whole bunch of different, see that one's way low. Got a whole bunch of different kinds here from various eras, and so it's hard to get a good visual. So I'm just gonna use our handy measuring wand. This didn't exist when I first learned to can. So I usually have gotten pretty good at doing it by eye. And there is a new pressure canner out that I've seen. And I don't know, I'm tempted. It seems such a cool idea. You can only do 5 quarts, you can't do 7. But the thing that I always factor in on that is you can't use it if the power goes out. And, you know, I could pressure can on a wood stove if I needed to, or on propane, you know, an outdoor propane stove, which I have several of. Can't do that if it's an electric canner. And then the thing about a regular pressure canner, it's almost no moving parts. Like, you occasionally have to replace the gasket, or if you have an all-American canner, you don't even have to do that. They're completely mechanical. And with an electric pressure canner, inevitably some circuit board is going to conk out. I'm on my second Instant Pot, which I love, but you know, they're not built to last. Our whole society is designed around planned obsolescence, and so, at least in terms of manufacturing. And so the idea of buying something, spending, you know, I think they're about $160, and then having to purchase it again in 2 years, it just seems like not worth the money. And I don't do a ton of pressure canning. I'm starting to do more of it, but it's definitely not something that I don't dig this thing out more than, less than once a month. So I'm not convinced. I think if I were gonna really splurge on something, I want these to have a little bit of space all the way around them. And so I'm just gonna these jars aren't that hot yet. I'm just gonna move things a bit. Because once I put this last one in here, it's gonna get real tight. So pressure canning is not like water bath canning in that the water doesn't cover the jars. It just comes up along their sides. So that looks good. But you have to have enough water in there that you can run it for an hour and a half and not have it go dry, because you are going to lose some moisture just simply because water is going to be evaporating slowly out of the top. All right, so we're going to bring this up to a full rolling boil. We're going to vent it for 10 minutes, and then we'll put our weight on. And this came with a 15-pound weight. I never can anything at 15 pounds, and I don't want to have to go get dial gauges tested all the time. And so I bought this multi-piece weight where this is 5 pounds, this is 10 pounds, and then there's a third ring that makes it 15 pounds. And this way, if this is jiggling, I know I'm at the proper weight for 10 to 11 pounds of pressure. I don't have to pay any attention to the gauge. This was a game changer in terms of the fiddliness of dial pressure canners. This is a 16 quart, I believe, Presto. I wish I had bought the 23 quart. The 16 quart you can do quart jars in. However, you cannot water bath quart jars in this. It's not tall enough. You can't put enough water in it to get an inch of water over the tops of the cans or the jars. And so if you want to use it for both water bath canning and pressure canning, don't get the 16 quart, get the 23 quart. It was $20 more at the time, and I thought, I'm not going to do that big of batches. I don't need the 23. I wish I'd gotten the 23. And so that's the one I recommend to people if you're going to start doing pressure canning. And then if you really have money and you want to buy one and hand it down to your grandchildren, buy an All-American. All-Americans, the seal is strictly based on the pressure of the lid to the bottom. There's no rubber gasket in there, and so there's literally nothing to fail. They will last forever. They are considerably more expensive, which is why I don't own one. But in terms of long-term homesteading and sustainability, that is definitely the way to go. So we will come back when this is fully vented and we're ready to put the weight on, and then we'll get to canning. Canner has been venting for 10 minutes. I'm going to put our weight on. This is here because when that isn't under pressure, it tends to spitter out water all over the kitchen, and so I just throw something over it to kind of absorb that. And so now we're gonna wait for this to come up to pressure on high heat. And then I've done this enough times that I know approximately where to turn it down to keep it going, where it doesn't have to be on high heat the entire time. But we'll be back. It's probably gonna take 5 or 10 minutes for that to come all the way up to temperature. We are up to pressure. You can see our weight is jiggling. That is jiggling because anytime it goes over the 10 to 11 pounds, it lets it off. So it will never go above that. As long as you hear that jiggling, you know that it's working and that it's where it should be. We're going to set our timer for 90 minutes. We've turned our heat down quite a bit. Normally, soup recipes go for 75 minutes for quarts. Because this recipe has ham in it, we are going to go ahead and do 90 minutes, which is what you would do if it was meat. And it is the same amount of time for the recipe for split pea soup that has ham in it, so I feel pretty confident of that. So yeah, 90 minutes of this. As long as this is continuing to jiggle, we're good. If it stops jiggling because there isn't enough heat underneath it, you have to start the timer completely over. So you do not want that to stop jiggling for 90 full minutes. Okay, we'll see where we end up. All right, our timer has gone off. So I've turned the heat completely off. And now we're just gonna wait until this gauge is all the way down at 0. This little pop-up has dropped back in, and this is obviously no longer rocking. And that's probably gonna take at least 15 minutes. All right, our pressure is completely released. Whenever you take the lid off of this, you always wanna take it, lean it away from you because there's gonna be a lot of steam and a lot of heat. And you don't want that all over you. Everything looks good. You can see they're still boiling. That's actually pretty typical. It takes a while for that to stop. What we're gonna do here is leave this sit for 5 minutes before we take them out of the canner. It will give them a chance to cool off a little bit more and hopefully maintain that seal. All right, we've pulled everything out of the canner. You can see they are still boiling, which is always just astounding to me. And so it's gonna take a while for these to cool down enough to seal. But I'm ready for my next batch, and so these are done. Looks like we did pretty good. I'm pretty happy with how they look. And it looks like we did a pretty good job of getting them about half full of contents and about half full of broth. So I have full confidence in the safety of these, and it's gonna make for some really wonderful weeknight or weekend meals this winter with a lovely crusty loaf of cornbread. So our bean soup has finally stopped bubbling. That took quite a while. I think it bubbled for at least an hour. And I just wanted to kind of reiterate like what's in this and how much of it is local or homegrown. So the pork hocks that were in this were from a local pig. I usually buy a half a pig every year. I did not buy one this last year because we had a lot of meat in the freezer and we still had quite a bit of pork from the previous year. But local pig and local processing. So those ham hocks were smoked and cured by a local guy who's just up the road a little bit from us. All of the beans in this I grew myself. And so they were a homegrown dried bean mix. The onions that were in here are homegrown. The garlic that's in here is homegrown. The parsley obviously is homegrown. So lots of good homegrown goodness in this soup. I'm very proud of this. It was a great way to use up some of the dried beans from last year, and I'm looking forward to having some great meals with that.